Welcome back, everybody. This is the final panel of our conference, The Gendered Politics of New Nationalisms. And I'm just going to briefly introduce our moderator for this panel, and we're very lucky to have him. David Gergen is a public service professor of public leadership and also serves as faculty director of the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard's Kennedy School. These are positions he has held for over a decade. He also serves as a senior political analyst for CNN and works actively with a rising generation of new leaders here and around the world. In the past, he has served as White House advisor to 4 U.S. presidents of both parties. And he wrote about those experiences in his New York Times bestseller, Eyewitness to Power, The Essence of Leadership, Nixon to Clinton. We're honored and thrilled to have him with us today, and so let me turn over the panel to David Gergen. David, thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the privilege of coming to participate, to listen to our 4 distinguished speakers. I want to acknowledge up front I've been unable to come to the earlier parts of this conference, so if I repeat something that's been said earlier, please excuse. You had your first session on rights and responsibilities, a very important question, in part defining the expanding rights in this country for various people. Whenever there's been a major conflict in this country about expanding the suffrage or expanding the participation, expanding the citizenship, usually the expansion forces have won, which has been, and we need to keep remembering that at a time of when so many are gloomy about what our prospects are. You then had a session on walls and borders. I'm sure that Donald Trump was trying to listen in and to change the conversation, but it was an opportunity to talk about who is in and who is out, who belongs and who doesn't, and this growing pushback against immigration, against refugees, against migrants, and the troubles they're facing, which I think is an extraordinarily important subject that on the world stage it deserves much more urgency than it has received. The average time for a migrant to go home, for a refugee to go home, is like 14 years. And people are living in tent cities in which not only their children are being born, but their grandchildren. So this issue is very much front and center around the world. You've just finished up with a speaker who told a very important story. And then finally we come to this issue, building on the populism theme of the last speaker, the keynote speaker, about nationalism. And what is seen by many now as a growing clash between the rise of nationalism and the effort to empower women and to ensure greater gender equality. In country after country, those issues are coming smash up against each other. So we have 4 distinguished panelists, and I'm very pleased to introduce up front Joan Williams, who is a distinguished professor of law at the Hastings School, and she's founding director of the Center for WorkLife Law at the UC Hastings College of Law. She's helped create the field of work-family studies and modern workplace flexibility in policies. Joan wrote a piece in the Harvard Business Review that was entitled, "What So Many People Don't Get About the U.S. Working Class." What so many people don't get about the U.S. working class. That article has been highly influential. It is the most read piece in the history of the Harvard Business Review. I asked her if she was going to give us a synopsis as part of her presentation, and she said, "I'm going to give an incendiary synopsis." Joan, over to you. Thank you.
And then I just go down. For Trump, everything is a masculinity contest, as when he treated that his nuclear button was much bigger and more powerful than Kim Jong-un's. Are we talking about buttons? I don't think so. Trump's truculence reflects what social psychologists call precarious masculinity, the sense that manhood is not a biological inevitability, but something that has to be earned over and over and over again, and that it's a zero-sum game, so one man's is the biggest around. In the US, this anxious masculinity proved reassuring, particularly in the face of the, quote, witch, as the alt-right referred to Hillary Clinton. The witch, of course, is the deadly stereotype that justified the murder of over 10,000 women in early modern Europe, many of them targeted because they were widows with property, and so were seen as subversive of the natural gender hierarchy. But the interesting issue is not Trump. It's the otherwise sensible people who voted for him. We voted with our middle finger, said one Trump South Carolina voter. Trump's election represented a collapse of the Democratic Party among the white working class, especially men. And that's why 4 crucial Rust Belt states swung the 2016 election. We've all heard a lot about the divide between the 1% and the 99%, but the divide that's driving American politics today is a divide between the professional managerial elite, the top 17%, and middle-class Americans, often called the white working class. They're really the middle 53%. What are they so angry about? Well, really 2 things. This slide shows the first. It's the demise of the American dream. Virtually all Americans born in the 1940s did better than their parents, but today it's less than half. And class has been etched into American geography, which explains that ocean of red in rural and Rust Belt America. Here's the 2016 election map. And you see the Democrats have really become a regional party. The second reason why the white working class is angry is cultural. They feel disrespected, and for a very simple reason, they are. After 1970s, elites stopped connecting with Americans whom prior generations gave a place of honor. So here is the Coit Tower murals painted in the 1930s. And you see how they celebrate the nobility of blue-collar work. That was on the wane by 1970s when blue-collar Archie Bunker of All in the Family was depicted as racist and sexist, stupid and fat. Then came Homer Simpson in the 1990s, who was amiable, but also stupid and fat. And bringing it up to the present day, think of Pennsatucky in Orange is the New Black, who was depicted as a white working class woman, and we were invited to laugh at her bad teeth. I enjoyed all 3 of these shows, actually, but this kind of thing has played into the hands of the far right. The alt-right also traffics in precarious masculinity. They attack traditional conservatives as, quote, cucks, men who raise the children of men who have cuckolded them. Traditional conservatives respond in kind, insulting the alt-right as, quote, childless single men who masturbate to anime. The alt-right is not blue-collar. Richard Spencer describes the classic member of his movement as someone who, quote, is 30 years old, who is a tech professional, who is an atheist, and who lives on one of the coasts. Greg Johnson, another alt-right leader, commented, "The alt-right is drawing a higher caliber of people than earlier iterations of American white nationalism because the career prospects of college-educated whites have declined, and a growing number of young whites are returning home to live with their parents, remaining unemployed or underemployed for a long time, and their resentment grows." Again, the theme, whether white collar or blue collar, there's nothing quite so dangerous as a man without a future. We see this when suicide becomes a career track for terrorists. We see it in the rise of neo-Nazis and anti-Semites at home. The alt-right is openly racist. Their goal is a white ethno-state without people of color, whether they were born here or not. The question is how we can peel off the economic anger from the racism. I suggest 3 steps, and I realize here that I have completely screwed this up. Okay, going back, I have all the pages. They're just in the wrong order.
It's a story of our lives.
There you go. There you go. There you go. Let me see if I can.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just improvise. You'll bear with me. One of the things that I think we have to focus on, well, I'm just going to read it. You'll do the math. I suggest 3 steps. One is to provide a middle-class standard of living instead of our economy, in which we have rich jobs for an ever-decreasing portion of the high elite and muck jobs for everyone else. The second is we need to stop insulting people. We need to respect people in blue-collar jobs for simple reasons. They're human beings. We are committed to social equality, and they do important work. When you turn on the tap in the morning to brush your teeth, they're the reason water comes out, not some Harvard grad. The third and most painful, we need to reassess our attitudes towards immigration. Today, progressives typically use an empathetic human rights lens for immigrants and a judgmental neoliberal, the race goes to the swift and you're not it lens for the white working class. And this is part of a deeper dynamic. Today, both elites in both Europe and the United States display their cosmopolitanism as a class act, a way of enacting elite class status. We're cosmopolitan because we went to college, where we formed global networks, and our job markets are global. That's just not true of middle-class people. It's not true of any non-elites. Their networks are very local. They're very rooted. They're much more focused than we are on community rather than just individual achievement. And you know, everyone tends to stress the high status social categories they belong to. That's why we cherish our classiness by displaying cosmopolitanism. Middle-class Americans, on the other hand, are very proud of being Americans. After all, that's one of the only high-status categories they belong to. To them, talk of open borders shows a shocking and hurtful lack of social solidarity. And that's true of the women as well as of the men. Many people are shocked that white working class women went so heavily for Trump. White women without college degrees voted for Trump by a 38-point margin. If they had just split 50-50, Clinton would have won. I wasn't surprised they didn't vote for Clinton, although I voted for her and worked endlessly for her. First, she failed to connect with them because of her focus on the glass ceiling. When you think about it, the glass ceiling is the metaphor that stands for my right to have as good a job as my elite father. Why do they care? They don't. Meanwhile, she was handed on a silver platter sexual harassment through the Access Hollywood tapes. That is an equal opportunity gender disadvantage. She completely ignored it. So the reason that it is that, and even if Clinton wasn't so class clueless, she was running uphill because women in blue-collar families suffer the same dignitary affronts as same-class men. They have the same pride in being Americans. They have the same sense of violation when that pride is written off as mere racism. Not to say that it's not mixed often with racism, but that's a different issue from whether it is only mere racism. And blue-collar women feel the same loss of blue-collar jobs, and they feel it as acutely as their men, because the level of sex segregation, it sharply decreased for the likes of us. It sharply decreased among professionals, but it's decreased very little in the working class contexts. And so they work pink-collar jobs. Have you ever tried to raise a family on a pink-collar job? Not easy. And that's what these women in blue-collar families say. Quote, "I voted for my boyfriend's job," said one Michigan Trump voter. The assumption that women would vote for Clinton to help her break the glass ceiling, a supreme example of class cluelessness. I don't know all the answers, but I know one thing for sure. We do need to end class cluelessness. It doesn't help immigrants. It doesn't help people of color. It doesn't help women or the environment. The only thing it helps is the far right. Thank you.
There's some count on the table there, no? Even worse.
Thank you, Joan, and I hope we can find your book easily here. Would you keep in mind a question I'd like to ask after everyone has spoken, and that is the place of our universities in solving this issue. Higher education is under assault in this country. The trust levels in higher education have been plunging, and it is because of a sense of elitism that is seen by the working class. And I'd just like to ask you, when we get back into the questions, about what we can do about that. How do we overcome and rebuild trust with the working class among our universities? So now our next speaker is Willem Duyvendak. I hope I didn't butcher that too much. Who is a distinguished research professor of sociology at the University of Amsterdam. And since January 1, I believe, is correct, has been the director of the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study in the Humanities and Social Science at the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. His main fields of research currently are belonging, fits right in with what we've been talking about, urban sociology, quote, feeling at home, and nativism. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much to the organizers of this conference for inviting me. I really feel honored to be part of this fantastic conference. As a scholar indeed of questions regarding belonging, feeling at home, nativism, nationalism, populism, I love the conference theme for sure, and I fully agree that citizenship is about more than just formal citizenship. But I'm not sure whether the deep emotion of feeling at home, the deep emotion of belonging, should be part of our understanding of citizenship. Don't get me wrong, it's important for all of us to feel at home, somewhere. But feeling at home, belonging, is a very particular emotion. When you really, truly feel somewhere at home, it often is an exclusionary emotion. It's with some people at some places. And that makes the emotion, as a political emotion, very difficult. So the question I will answer is, should citizenship be based on those we feel at home with? And that is a difficult question to answer. My hesitation or my skepsis about such a more cultural or emotional definition, sentimental definition of citizenship, is born out of my study of my own country, the Netherlands, which I normally would never speak about. It is an uninteresting, small, tiny, not very important country. But for today, it is important, and I will explain why it is important. Because in this very particular country, politicians, nor the public opinion, doesn't stop speaking the language of feeling at home. And particularly the white people tell us all the time that they don't feel at home anymore in the country they live in. And this new nationalism that developed is quite puzzling, because this new nationalism is so much based on the idea that we have to share all our values, norms, and feelings. And to be honest, those feelings, those norms and values are rather sympathetic to me because they are progressive. But as I will try to show in the coming 12 minutes, they might be progressive, but they are at the same time highly exclusionary towards those we assume do not share in those same values and feelings. So let me try to explain that. I'm not going to bother you with a long history of this very tiny country, although there are some historical connections between the Netherlands and the US. But there are many misunderstandings out there. Just very briefly, some scholars think that the Dutch have pursued multicultural policies. That's not true at all. But what is important to realize is that we indeed have some laws that stem for more than 100 years and that dealt with a way to, that the Netherlands were very divided religiously, and how to live together in a harmonious way while being so different. And therefore, we had a societal system called pillarization, and everybody was locked up in his own pillar. So Protestant pillar, Roman Catholic pillar, and everybody had to live in those pillars, and there were no connections, no way to marry somebody from the other pillar. And for a long time, that worked really very well. But you have to understand that this pillarization was experienced over time more and more as suffocating. You were locked up in your own pillar, and you could not even communicate with others. And what's important to understand then is that the 1960s were celebrated in this very conservative, pillarized country, the Netherlands, as an enormous liberation, because people could break out of their pillars and come into contact with those of other pillars. And there are very few countries, Michel Lemont told me perhaps it's the same, it's true for Quebec, but there are very few countries, I think, that saw such an enormous change as the Dutch during the 1960s and the late 1960s, the early 1970s. Almost 50% of the Dutch lost their faith in a period of 5 years. Imagine what that does to the country, right? That's enormous. So that became a highly secularized country, celebrating sexual freedom, and that materialized also in all kinds of progressive laws, as you might know, regarding euthanasia, abortion, drug policies, and somewhat later gay marriage, but the first in the world. So May '68 had far more impact in Amsterdam than it had in Paris, to give a very short summary. And that's interesting because the Netherlands, being one of the most conservative countries in Europe, for a very long time became one of the most progressive countries. And that is now even more true than in the 1970s, because over the past decades, also populist parties, Christian Democrats and right-wing liberals came to share into those liberal and progressive consensus, which is obviously very different from the situation in the United States and in many other countries, the UK, France, and so on. So what happened was that we were very divided in the 1960s, and now we have become very consensual and not hyper-diverse. And for a while, this developing consensus still respected differences, some tolerance was there. There was some, let's say, tolerant monoculturalism towards newcomers, often guest workers, Muslim guest workers, but also some tolerance towards the Orthodox Protestants who still live in the Netherlands, who are a rather small group now today. But today, particularly the Muslim migrants are not framed anymore, are not tolerated anymore. They are framed as intolerant, and we don't have to be tolerant towards those who are not tolerant towards us, right? So this is the intolerance towards intolerance. In this self-image of the Dutch, in this national story, gender and sexuality play a pivotal role. The parliament in the Netherlands doesn't stop talking about sex and gender. It's all the time there. Whatever kind of debate we have, it always boils down to topics of sexuality and gender. It's interesting, I don't have time to go into that. In some of the Western countries where we see parallels, it's more in the self-image about gender equality, for instance, Denmark and France. In the Netherlands, it's more about sexuality and homosexuality. We can think, why exactly are those differences out there? But it is important to realize that nowadays gender equality and LGBT rights are considered as the core of Dutchness, also by the far-right populist. Wilders, you might have heard about him, of the Freedom Party. He doesn't stop talking about how proud he is that we have gay marriage, and also the Christian Democratic parties. We can discuss more about why the values of the 1960s have become so important in the Netherlands, but for sure, in the past 15 years, the embrace of those values by the populists and by the far right and by the liberal right wing and by the Christian Democrats has developed an opposition to Muslims, right? That has been the core reasoning, and the logic is very simple. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? And then there was the idea that Muslims can never care for gender equality or can never be LGBTI friendly. Other scholars, Jasbir Puar, Joan Scott, Sarah Ferris, have labeled this development, as you might know, as homo-nationalism or femo-nationalism, progressive forms of nationalism that put the women's movement and the LGBT movement, but also queer Muslims and feminist movements in a very difficult position. Because the moment you mobilize for those values, it looks as if you're immediately anti-Muslim and the other way around. So the problem is, it is fantastic, at least in my perspective, that progressive values are broadly embraced, but at whose expense? I think we should think about that. And what does it produce? It produces a self-image as if the Dutch have always been that progressive, right? So now the story is that since the 17th century, the Dutch always embraced LGBT rights and women's rights. And it is totally essentialized. Obviously, it doesn't do much justice to the history. As I already explained, we were one of the most conservative countries in Europe. And Muslims then are also fixed, right, in their identities. They are eternal backwards. They are unchangeable and unchanging. It means the rise of nativism. It means that some people are considered to be more truly Dutch because they embrace LGBT rights and women's rights, and those are then the white Dutch. They consider themselves as being the true Dutch because they are so progressive. And it brings me to my last slide, so I'm quite fine on time, I guess. And it's somewhat linking to the second panel we had this morning. Because why would it be an important story, right? I almost apologetically said we shouldn't talk too much about the Netherlands, but it's not just about the Netherlands. There is a broader story here, and let me draw 4 conclusions, give 4 reasons why this is an important story. Because first of all, it's part of a broader tendency in which the most progressive countries in Europe become the most migrant unfriendly. You might have heard how harsh the Danish people, Denmark, for example, has become. Another country, like all the Nordic countries that were always outstandingly progressive, has become very harsh and don't want to accept migrants so easily anymore. Second, why is it an important story? Because among the populist parties, things are happening that you might perhaps not expect. Even though Trump also, right, sometimes mentions LGBTI rights and women's rights, obviously for highly opportunistic reasons, but we have to understand why populist parties are embracing that discourse. And we see it happening. It started in Denmark, then the Netherlands, Germany, France. So almost all Western European countries with very strong populist parties are more in this discourse in which they claim modernity, in which they claim that the Judeo-Christian tradition is about equality for gender and sexual equality. It is obviously then in the dynamic of bashing Muslims in the logic I already explained. The third reason why this is important, because it marginalizes and isolates Muslims or religious minorities at large in Western European countries, right? They are depicted as totally alien and as if they can never become truly Dutch. And fourth, this is important because this translates and is part of a worldwide polarization. A worldwide polarization enthusiastically spiraled from two sides, briefly sketched, very sketchy, so the northwestern part of the world and the east-south part of the world, those are opposing each other, and most of the Western countries then are posing as modern and as LGBTI friendly and of course in favor of women's rights. But they don't frame it in terms of human rights, universal human rights. No, those are Western values, right? And the other side, so Eastern Europe, Russia, the Vatican, Muslim majority countries, they say, yes, you're right, those are your values. And we are proudly disagreeing. We are conservative, we are traditionals. We value family values in the way we do it. And indeed, let's stop discussing in terms of universal human rights. So both sides are reinforcing the idea that we have only very localized values and that it should remain like that. And therefore, the changes in those countries, so well discussed this morning, are so difficult. To conclude, what perhaps looks hopeful and perhaps innocent, progressive dominance, right? I can imagine you are dreaming of it, has a dark side, and we have to realize that. It has a dark side in combination with certain forms of nationalism, because gender and sexuality then are not defined, equal rights for women, for LGBTI, are not defined anymore in terms of universal human rights, but only those parties support it because that's part of being Dutch, or being German, or being Danish. When citizenship becomes dependent on feeling at home with just those who are exactly as progressive, how inclusive are we then? I mean, that's the question we ask ourselves in the Netherlands, right? If we only want to live with people who are exactly the same as we are, and then it is not important whether it's progressive or it's conservative, it's the idea, what is our notion of citizenship? And if you put belonging central, that is not necessarily then very inclusive. Aren't we losing our ability to deal with differences in, for instance, my country? And is progressive nationalism then perhaps not very counterproductive? Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, John Willem. That was a head-twisting presentation. I think that it challenges the conventional wisdom that most of the authoritarian strongmen in the countries that have been moving to authoritarianism have been led there by more conservative forces in the society, not by people who support women's empowerment or gay rights or the rest. So maybe we could explore that a little more in the questions that would help us understand that. It was a fascinating set of insights and propositions. It's just, I'd like to go, if we could, go deeper on how it all works together and how it fits. And perhaps our next speaker can also shed light on that. Fatma Müge Göçek. She's a professor of sociology and women's studies at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on the comparative analysis of history, politics, and gender in the first and third worlds. She critically analyzes the impact of processes such as development, nationalism, religious movements, and collective violence on minorities. She does come to us from the University of Michigan, but it's also notable that she is from Turkey originally and is very familiar with what's going on in that country. And I think it fits very nicely to compare and contrast what we just heard from John Wilhelm. But Fatma, thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for inviting me here and enabling me to share my views with you. Actually, I think it is interesting. When I heard, and saw the title of the conference, it said, "Who belongs?" The first thought I had was, where's my passport? And then I said, well, I have my driver's license. That ought to be enough. I'm saying that because I think what I will have to say relates to the two speakers before, because I've spent half my life in Turkey and the other half in the United States. So at this point, I would say that mine is more of an in-betweenness between the two contexts. And all the sort of talks until now has sort of triggered in me and made me realize that, yes, of course, because of the subject matter that I specialize in, I do know social change, Middle East social movements pretty well because I work on it. But I also have some opinions about the United States because I have lived here and I am also an American citizen. So the reason I'm bringing that up is I do not think that we have, who belongs has this assumption beneath that youth can only belong to one place and not another. What about people who belong or who think they belong to more than one place? Or, that I think is the problem. I mean, it is the almost what I have this notion I'm working on called ontological nationalism. Ontology meaning social reality. I think what's very significant about nationalism is that you either have one social reality or you have another one, but you cannot have both at the same time. Why am I saying that? When I first came to this country, I was very miserable, not because, I came in incredible conditions to do a PhD at an Ivy League school and all that, but what was important was I thought about Turkey and I was so sad about how many resources there were and how much of it was being squandered, or it was so sad they didn't exist in Turkey. So when I went back to Turkey, I would be miserable there and say, oh my God, there are all these brilliant people here and there are no resources. And then I realized after a while living in both societies, which I've done now half and half, I don't belong to neither one. I mean, I no longer am considered Turkish, even though I'm ethnically Turkish for generations, because in this day of ethnic nationalism in Turkey, that ought to be something. But I lost that when I started working on the Armenian issue, and I looked and wrote a book on why the Armenian genocide and the collective violence against the Armenians has been denied by Turkish state and society for 220 years, as a consequence of which everybody was sure that I was of Armenian origin because they cannot imagine that I could be, an ethnic Turk. I mean, which tells you about this ontological nationalism that I'm talking about. And then, of course, I came here, and when I was here, as I said, I live here. I have had a lot of experience here. I have actually lived here more than I have in Turkey at this point. But I am still seen as Turkish to a certain degree. And this, I think, is what we ought to think about when we think about what is it. We have to, we have to look at the assumptions of whiteness, not only in terms of exclusion, but in terms of inclusion or resisting that inclusion. Because obviously I speak English with an accent. So they would say to me, oh, wonderful, I'm great and all that. And they say, where are you from? I'm now in Ann Arbor. I would say New Jersey because I came to Princeton, right? I mean, but it's a test. So then they would say, where are you really from? So I would say, guess, because I'm not going to, I refuse to have them pigeonhole me. It's actually very interesting about the person, the author who was talking, she refused to be pigeonholed. But I think that is something that comes from those of us who have lived in more than one context. That is, I think, the vision of the future that will get us beyond multiculturalism. But in order to get basically insight into how that would work, I don't only look at Turkey, I also look at the United States. Who do you think inspires me in the United States, you may ask? I would say W.E. Du Bois is my amazing, hero at the moment, because only he captures what I feel through his notion of double consciousness. I think I have, of course, I will never presume to have the violent past that African Americans have had in this country. That's not what I meant. But I mean in terms of belonging and not belonging. And that, of course, makes me think at the same time that how is it that we can go beyond this ontological sort of nationalism that leaves people out, that doesn't leave spaces for people. That is the polarization that's leading us. At least if they othered you, they enabled you to still continue living in that society. When you have ontological nationalism, they want you to disappear. They want to send you back. They don't allow a space for you even here. Where does that come from? I will talk a bit in more detail about what is in Turkey, but because I have lived in both societies, I always ask the same questions of both societies, because I don't think it is fair for me to be only critical in one or the other. I have to be able to ask the same questions in both. So as a consequence, and of course I am very informed, let's say, by critical race theory and feminist theory. As a consequence, the insights I have in analyzing and teaching my students here, most of whom, of course, are Americans, belong to and necessitate that I know about American history. But my specialization on the Middle East also necessitates that I know there, and of course my own experiences that first half of my life enable me to also know in that context. If you look about into the United States, I think we have to have a total reinterpretation of what it is to belong to the United States. And I would do that on two grounds. One is, of course, the ground of intersectionality that first was developed by Patricia Hill Collins' Matrix of Domination, and then developed by Kimberly Crenshaw's notion of you get public visibility, in that case for black women, because they are excluded from the civil rights movement for being women and from the feminist movement for being black. So what the argument there is, you have to look at not only one category in a society, you have to look at the intersection of multiple categories to see the inequality and power relations that are hidden there. So that is one insight. The other end, if you do that, I think, as we saw with the working class, you see the variation, especially I like the fact that you said white working class, because that is, I think that has very different dynamics than the non-white working class, I mean, and the issues faced by them. And on the, you know, so that is the intersectionality. The second thing, I think, is history. History and the foundational violences in a society that haven't been adequately addressed. In our context, in the United States, I do not think, if you think about, and I will do this in Turkey, but I'm starting by doing it in the United States, what are the foundational social actors of the United States who have made the United States possible? Our foundation myth in this country is settled on white settlers. Yes, we say we the people, but who are the we and who is included in the we and who isn't? I would argue that there are three social actors. There are the white settlers, there are the Native Americans whose lands we have built everything on, and there are the African Americans who provided the labor for all that to happen. Look at our ontological nationalism in the United States. We only acknowledge one group. We do not acknowledge the other. Not only do we not acknowledge it, they are the ones who are suffering the most in the United States. And I'm not talking about the other non-whites who have come later in various forms. I'm just saying foundational. So that is the framework I want you to think about when I now turn to Turkey and explain to you what happens in that context, because that's obviously what I specialize in. If you look at Turkey and the nationalism in Turkey, we do have Tayyip Erdogan, the president, and we do have, of course, Trump here. In my life, the two people also intersect in a very interesting way, because of the work I have done in Turkey with respect to the Armenian genocide, followed by the fact that I'm now working on the Kurds, because I focus on minorities, and as a consequence, the violence, state violence and others, and I signed a petition along with Nilüfer Göle, who's my friend in crime, fellow terrorist, because we signed a petition saying Kurds should not be killed, you should talk to them instead. The president, Erdogan, said that we were terrorists. That he said there is no difference between a terrorist machine gun and a scholar's pen. So as a consequence, you know, we have, since then, I cannot go back to Turkey. So I have left, I mean, I have Turkish citizenship, but who knows for how long? I mean, I haven't been able to go back for 3 years. So recently, after Trump's election, my mother, who is back in Turkey, occasionally keeps calling me whenever I go on international, you know, talks. And she says, have you gotten back? Is it okay? And I'm saying, yeah, I'm an American citizen. What do you think? So then the truth came out. She said, look, you had 2 citizenships. You basically now cannot go to Turkey. You're down to 1. So you better, you know, don't make too much noise, because you'll have no other place to go. I said, Mom, don't you worry. I'm very close to Windsor, Canada. I could always go there. I mean, so that is the other. With respect to nationalisms in Turkey, what we have today, I think, is a much more violent form of ontological destruction in a way, because there were initially 4 founding social actors in the transition from empire to nation state in that context. There were the Greeks, who were then basically scared, and about 300,000 were forced to migrate, also through population exchange, to Greece. There were the Armenians, who also claimed, of course, these are the 4 social actors that claimed Turkey as their ancestral lands. Greeks were sent to Greece. Armenians were, of course, destroyed through the Armenian genocide. That left the Kurds and the Turks together initially. What happened was that when you look at history and what happened in the transition in writing our foundation myth, until the Republic was founded, the Kurds were seen as one of the 2 essential actors of the Turkish Republic. Once the borders were put in place, all mention of Kurdish element is totally silenced. And I think that explains very well why we have the violence and the basically approval of violence, not only by Turkish state and also by Turkish society, as we see in Afrin, because in Afrin, not only have the Turkish military gone in there and destroyed all the, and massacred and plundered all Kurdish people and property, but they say they did it, of course, with all the arms and armaments that the United States and Europe provided for Turkey, and we haven't done anything about it in the United States. So for me, therefore, you cannot separate what goes on in Turkey and the nationalism there from what we are doing here, because if you separate it, what disappears is responsibility. And we have to, I think, bring back that moral responsibility, and I'll leave there because I don't have time. Thank you so much.
Fatma, thank you very, very much. I'm getting a little concerned about time. We have one more speaker. We're going to have our time for questions, I'm afraid, is going to be cut short, but we'll do the best we can. But I do want to introduce and bring to the stage now Rina Verma Williams, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Cincinnati, where she is also an affiliate faculty member in Asian Studies and in the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. Her research and teaching interests include comparative Indian and South Asian politics. I wondered how you were going to respond to the Northwestern versus the Southeastern tension that we heard about earlier. But comparative Indian and South Asian politics, religion, law, nationalism, politics of the global South, and gender and identity politics. Do you wake up each day wondering which one of those you'll study?
All together.
Okay, thank you for coming and joining us, Rina.
Thank you. Great, thank you. So the last speaker of the last panel of the day, no pressure there. We've had such a wonderful slew of panels, but I'm not letting it get to me. Thank you to Radcliffe for putting this terrific set of panels, day and a half really together. Thanks to Dean Cohen for inviting me and Rebecca and your terrific team for just making this all run as smoothly as silk. It is great to be back in Cambridge, though it's changed a lot in the last 20 years. I am still traumatized about the idea that the Oban Pan is gone from that spot, but I'll get over it. I'll get over it slowly. So I wanted to start with this phrase, "This is not the America I know." And I wanted to start my brief remarks with this phrase because I feel like I've heard it so much in the last year, or really the last several years. And I feel like it captures a great deal of the sort of, I have turmoil in my notes, and I think that's maybe not, that's not an inaccurate word, right? The sort of turmoil that we've been trying to consider during this conference. So this phrase is fundamentally about questions of citizenship and belonging, but also ownership. Who owns America? Who gets to decide what America is? So notice that for me, there are two questions embedded here, not just who belongs to the nation, but who does the nation belong to? I think both of those are equally important questions. And so I've heard this phrase, or some version of it, from multiple places across the political spectrum. Certainly with the election results last year, I've heard this phrase from many progressives, many of my colleagues, students, those who mean to disavow what they read the Trump election victory and presidency to represent. I initially started with the goal of saying I'm not going to say Trump, but I think that's both silly and inaccurate. So I put it right in there. I've heard this phrase from immigrants, people like my parents who came here 50 years ago to complete their education and build a better life for themselves and their kids, and to send their daughter to Harvard to get a PhD, a better life than the one that they thought they could have in their native homes. But I've also heard it in different forms before Trump's election from those who opposed Obama in his presidency, who opposed Hillary's candidacy, and the Democrats in general in certain ways. And lastly, I must add that I have not heard this phrase from too many of my African American friends and colleagues and family, who have been much more likely to say, often with a smirk, I don't know, this seems pretty much like the America we've always known. So there's something there that we also need to think about. All right, so we all know how tribal American politics has become. There's no need to recap that in any amount of detail, so I'm not going to do that. What is striking to me, though, as a scholar of nationalism, is that this partisan tribalism is actually about the very nature and definition of the nation itself, right? It's about what America actually is. It's not about what's good or bad for America, or the best paths forward for America, or even how to correct past policy mistakes or anything like that. Anything that sort of normal political processes can, at some level, handle. Instead, what's up for debate is the very core question of what America is. Just a quick disclaimer I want to throw in at this point. In this talk, I will use America to mean the US, but I also want to acknowledge, and I understand that doing so can serve to elide all the other countries of the hemisphere, though that is not my intention. It's a simplifying tool for me right now. So I study Indian politics, and within that, I focus on all those things that David mentioned: religion, gender, nationalism. I really do try to look at how they all mush together. As well as law and democracy and political parties. You can't really study one without the other. And in some ways, it's weird not to be talking about India today. I'm actually focusing on the US, which is in certain ways kind of freeing in some of the ways that Champa Lahiri talked about. And what I want to say is that when I see what's going on in US politics, and I mean in the senses that Fatma talked about, I study Indian politics, but I've been educated and grown up my whole life in this country, and you can't get a degree in political science without knowing about American politics in an academic sense, as well as in a personal sense. So I feel entirely comfortable talking about US politics, but when I see what's going on, I sort of naturally try to draw on what I know about nationalism in general to try to make sense of it. So that's a little bit of what I want to try to share with you today. And in fact, for someone who studied nationalism in many forms all over the world for a few years, if not decades, it actually seems crystal clear to me what's going on, or at least I feel like I can make some sense of our current situation in terms that I know from studying nationalism. And again, that's what I want to share with you today. So for many decades, scholars of nationalism have drawn a distinction between two different types or forms of nationalism that I have listed here for you. They've gone by different names at different times, but at root, I think they can best be described and understood as ethnic and civic nationalism. Ethnic nationalism represents a community of descent, D-E-S-C-E-N-T, not descent into chaos, but like bloodline descent, maybe descent into chaos too eventually. The ethnic nation is sort of rooted in socio-cultural loyalties. The nation's constituted on the basis of bloodlines, whether real or imagined or believed, kin-like relations. So an ethnic nation is like one big family, whether it's happy or not. Civic nationalism, on the other hand, is based in political institutional ties. It's more about shared political beliefs, shared ideology, rather than a shared ethnic background. Now notice that in ethnic nationalism, you're born into a nation, right? You can't choose or change or abandon your nationality. Whereas in civic nationalism, citizenship is a matter of choice. You can choose to leave one nationality, you can pledge loyalty to another one, as long as you are pledging loyalty to the beliefs and ideologies that constitute that nation. Bless you. And obviously then, both the question, I hope that doesn't mean you're allergic to the framework I'm putting up. We'll go into that in Q&A. So obviously then, both the question of who belongs to the nation and who the nation belongs to, both those questions are answered very differently in civic and ethnic nationalism, right? Ethnic nationalism, you either belong to the group or you don't. You were born into it or you weren't. Whereas civic nationalism, anyone in theory could belong to the nation. And so hopefully at this point, many of you can figure out where I'm trying to go with this. I believe that the US is struggling with the question of whether we're fundamentally a civic or an ethnic nation. And to be explicit, America has long gotten by with the veneer, or more cynically, the myth of being a civic nation. And I think that we could get away with that for so long as the underpinning ethnic basis of our civic nationalism remained dominant, even if dormant, right? And we all know what that ethnic basis is. It's Judeo-Christian, perhaps even more accurately Anglo-Saxon Protestant, primarily of European descent, and white, however that's defined at any given historical moment. But now we're reaching a tipping point. As the US becomes a minority-majority nation, or maybe it's majority-minority, I'm never clear, that ethnic foundation is threatened. Or certain groups of people feel or sense that that foundation is threatened. And so that foundation is trying to reassert itself, or those people are trying to reassert it, right? The people who feel the sense of threat. And these groups, these elements, I believe, are the ones that not only openly support Trump, that sort of 30% of the population that will never budge from supporting him, but also, I think, very significant numbers of people, that middle 30 to 40%, who feel the vague uneasiness of not really liking Trump. They don't like Trump. To some extent, I think maybe what Joan called the sensible voters, right? But they don't really like the other side. They don't trust where they think the country is headed, or where the other side is either trying to take the country or seems willing to let it go. A couple of things to note regarding the debate framed in this way. First, the US has not just been considered and considers itself to be a civic nation, but really the ultimate example of a civic nation, right? We were supposed to be the example to show that civic nationalism really worked. What we all share that makes us American is a set of beliefs and ideology, right? We believe in democracy, individual freedoms, et cetera, et cetera. And then another thing to make note of, the ultimate example of ethnic nationalism has long been considered to be Germany, especially pre-World War II Germany. We all know where that went. It was not good. So ethnic nationalism has a good long history of being looked at askance. I won't really have time to go global with this. I think that this civic versus ethnic nationalism clash can explain a lot of things around the world, including India, which I'm happy to go into during Q&A or follow-up if you want, right? My argument is always that in India we had our Trump in 2014, right? We had him 2.5 years before we had ours in the US. India is definitely has brought to power a party that rejects a secular civic definition of India. It wants to resurrect an ethnic Hindu religious definition of India. So we're at Radcliffe, and I don't want to miss the women in nationalism part, so I will close with this. Feminist scholars of nationalism, if not always the mainstream scholars of nationalism, have long argued and understood the critical role of gender in constructing national identities. They've explained how women are seen as those who propagate the nation, both literally by producing children, but also culturally in passing on language and values to the next generation. Women attend to hearth and home when men are away fighting for the nation. They're also the reason to fight to protect the nation, right? Protecting the women and children. And women often symbolize the nation itself, like some of these images I have here, like Marianne in France, and this this famous image of Durga in India. But to me, these, in the terms we've just talked about, like these symbols of the nation and of nationalism are more linked to ethnic forms of nationalism rather than civic. It's more ethnic nationalism that women would play these kinds of roles in, right? Propagating the nation. And in fact, even feminist scholars of nationalism haven't done enough thinking, I would say, about the role of women and gender in civic nationalisms. Maybe that's another book to write in the next few years. I mean, in theory, civic nationalism should be much less gendered. therefore perhaps more egalitarian, I'm not sure, I have to think about it, we can think about it together, than ethnic nationalism. But the idea of a retrenchment on an ethnic form or basis for US nationalism also goes some way, in my view, to explain something that others have found puzzling, and that is the support of white women in particular for Trump. And not often just the working class white women, right? Even the more educated and wealthier white women. Despite all the sort of many egregious reasons there have been for women to have, and for anyone in fact, to where they could have or should have abandoned their support of him. But if one takes the primary concern to be the sort of refounding or reasserting or reaffirming the ethnic basis of US nationalism, then to me at least that makes more sense, that they would continue to support him anyway, if that's what they believe he's doing. So to conclude, just a moment to think through what all this might mean. The first thing I would say is I'm not sure I'm trying to make an argument about whether ethnic or civic nationalism will sort of win out in this battle. I myself am kind of rooting for civic nationalism to win out, not least because it's an example I want to see succeed. I think the possibilities for women are probably better in civic nationalism. But to me, rather, it's more about like what combination of civic and ethnic nationalism will be left when this is all behind us. It's about whether the underlying fear is justified, the fear that our civic aspects are actually built on ethnic foundations, and that they always have been, whether it was acknowledged or not. That if the ethnic foundation shifts as the country becomes more diverse, will the civic structure that we've built on it collapse? Was civic nationalism a myth all along? Can we ever have a truly civic nationalism without that underlying ethnic base? These, to me, are the questions we need to watch and think about and grapple with going forward. I'm not going to stand here and pretend to have any answers, but I'm certainly interested in watching the game and hope that the outcome is the right one. And no matter what, I always believe in trying to make sure we're asking the right questions. So I'll end there.
Yeah, thank you. Just a word, I might point out that in the last couple of weeks, the Parkland kids came here from Florida. There were 7 who came to the Kennedy School and spent an evening and a day, and we had a chance to talk to them and ask them and try to figure out why. How could it possibly be at a time when there's a lot of negativity about the millennials and who they are and what they represent, and these kids come forward and they're poised, they're articulate, they're passionate, and they understand history and they seem to understand our civic life. And it turns out they have a very strong civics program at that school. And it made a difference in terms of the civic nationalism that you were just discussing. But I wanted to ask Joan briefly. I have just 2 questions, and we're going to go to the floor as long as we can. Joan, I briefly asked in the beginning, what about the elitism in American universities? A Pew poll found that a stunning 40% of people think that universities are bad for the country. Bad for the country. They're crown jewels. So what do we do? If Larry Bacow came to you and said, I'm taking over Harvard, saying, what should I do?
Well, I'm going to give a short answer because I'm eager to hear from the audience. I think there's been a systematic program for several decades to undermine American education, starting with the inner cities, but certainly not ending there. And I think it's been very effective, and it's been absolutely devastating for American civic life. And I think the attack on the universities is just the latest version of that.
And where is that coming from, though? Right with the effort to dismantle and discredit?
I think that it is coming from people who would prefer a passive and uneducated electorate. As I say, I'm eager to hear from the audience, so I'm going to keep it really short.
Let me ask the group then one question. The United States is soon going to be a country with the whites, Caucasians no longer in a majority. We're going to have a majority of minorities. And the central issue becomes, can a multi-ethnic society succeed? And I just would like to ask you, is there an example you can point to of a multi-ethnic society that has been successful? Or what country would you point to that's come the closest?
Well, it depends on how you define success, doesn't it?
Well, it does.
But just to say something, I mean, if you want to have a post-colonial take on why is it that universities are taken on, one can argue that we are switching from an entitlement society to an achievement society. And the universities, of course, are where you go when you achieve something, whereas the rest, of course, no longer have the entitlements, which they had always thought was achievement that came because of what they did rather than because of where they were born and what they were born in.
Working class families would argue that the sons and daughters who are going to these elite universities do feel entitled, and they're there because they had a certain amount of entitlement in life.
Their children feel that.
Well, that others look at it and say, well, you got in, you got a legacy, you got all these other things that are going on. You come from an entitled
we did have a
class.
legacy. That's why I got into Yale.
Yeah.
But again, let's go back to this question: can multi-ethnic societies work? Which ones are coming the closest?
Perhaps if I go ahead.
One thing, when you say multi-ethnic, you assume that all ethnicities are equal to each other, and they are not. Multi-ethnic means that because of history, because of intersectionality with power, some ethnicities are always more privileged than other ones.
Sure.
If you bring them together, then you cannot assume that they are all the same.
Given that, how do countries overcome the challenge, please?
I wonder if I could ask,
Yeah.
ask a question in return, which is, which society has not been multi-ethnic, right? The myth, or one can have a majority ethnicity, but I think anything but a multi-ethnic society at some level is not a fully real thing.
Go back to the fundamental argument underlying all of this is that many people no longer feel at home. And a lot of those people have come from the majority who now feel like they're turning into the minority. And they're being overwhelmed by others who are coming in from the outside.
In Europe, and perhaps also a little bit in the US, there is this kind of new theorizing in terms of super diversity. So that's very much that all countries, or many countries, many cities become minority-majority. So indeed, the white mainstream would then be disappearing. And I agree with you. This suggestion that it's new, but also the suggestion because we have so many ethnicities and therefore there's no mainstream anymore is not very sociological. I mean, there are many ethnicities, but indeed there are still rather dominant groups and groups that are less dominant. It might be that the numerical changes makes the majority, even if they are perhaps not the majority in numbers anymore, but they are still the mainstream, nevertheless they might feel threatened, right? And that's what's happening with many white Americans at this moment. But there are then basic sociological questions to ask. Does that mean, indeed, that the mainstream as such is totally disappearing? Is that what is happening? I don't think that multi-ethnicity necessarily implies that, to be honest. And the second question, and it's a more painful question, why do those white people feel so threatened? Or, to frame it even more painful, why do they feel entitled to have a higher status position than others? And in that sense, I'm ambivalent about what John said. On the one hand, of course, you're totally right that the white working class deserves dignity, right? And that we treat them with dignity. But the question is whether they will be satisfied with that. The thing is that they often think that they deserve to be better off. I mean, otherwise, how to confront their racism, their homophobia, and so on, right? So I'm sympathetic to that you want to give them back their value, but the thing is that what they are asking for?
And just to I totally agree with you, but to add to that, whites are not also one monolithic category either. I mean, that is also, I think, a problem. We have to divide the whites who are critical, like most of you in this room, including you all, and whites who want things to be, who have naturalized that privilege and who want to sustain that privilege and have no interest whatsoever in saying, why do we have this privilege? Where did it come from? Should we have it in the past, or in the future? Should we share it with other people? I mean, those are, I want whites to be normalized whites and critical whites. Critical whites, I think, very important, because change positively can only emerge when those critical whites are together with the non-whites. Otherwise, we will stay totally polarized from each other. Why do I say this? I am an ethnic Turk. When I studied the Armenian genocide, I belonged to the perpetrator category. That was important. I did not belong to the victim category. I mean, who is victimized in this situation? We have to be aware that those who belong to the dominant white category can also own responsibility. That's what Hannah Arendt talks about, is that they can say, we are responsible, this is our society, for change will be aligning with the non-whites and change the other normalized whites.
Joan, you go, John Willem.
Do you mind, Rina? Do you want to?
Go ahead.
I think that racism and a sense of class, what's been called the hidden injuries of class, I think they've gotten all mixed up together. And I think some people are not interested in giving up the racism. And I think for those people who are not giving up the racism, I'm not interested. I'm not going there. But I think for a lot of people, if you say to them, there are a couple of deals that are being offered. You can continue to have your muck jobs and your racism, or we can offer you the dignity that is due to all working people of all races, because you do important work, and you're entitled to a middle-class standard of living because we're one of the most richest countries in the world. Yeah. And if you're interested in that deal, we have a wide tent and we welcome you here. I think that we wouldn't get all of the white working class. I think we would get enough of them, and I think we would treat our fellow citizens with dignity. Let me just say one quick other thing, which is, are these people racist? They are white people. White people are racist. We're racist too.
Are you saying all white people are racist?
I'm saying that I'm talking about 40 years of studies that show that the professional managerial elite prides themselves on their merit. So 40 years of studies shows that they fault people of color for lack of merit. The white working class prides themselves on their morality. So 40 years of studies show that they fault people of color for lack of morality. I'm not a favor of either kind of racism, but I find it truly troubling and off-putting when elites use anti-racism as an excuse for snobbery. And I do not think that helps people of color.
I'm just curious about your view and how that's consistent with treating people with dignity if they feel you're calling them racist.
Well, I'm interested in whatever Rina wants to say.
That's a good handout.
Rina's going to speak about going back to our previous conversation. Go ahead, please.
I'm not sure which question I'm answering. The one thing that came to my mind in terms of your earlier question about whether any multi-ethnic society has ever succeeded, it brought to mind the word fear, right? The fear of I'm not saying you're afraid, I'm saying the question made me think of that, or maybe you're afraid, I don't know. But I don't want to assume, right? The fear of how is this going to work? How is this American experiment in civic nationalism going to work without the underlying ethnic basis or foundation that's always been there? And that is a scary question. Like I said, I stood up there and I said, I don't know the answer. I hope it works. I think it can work. Exactly how it will work, I'm not sure. But that's the sense I get underneath. In terms of Joan, I love your deal. I would grab it in a moment. I'm not sure how many takers one would get. I mean, I have read the sort of
Is it worth a
studies of
try?
people.
Is it worth it?
Oh, it's definitely, no, I think we have to try, there's no question. And then whether people take it or not that's on them. But the studies I've seen and heard that, I find very perturbing, where if you, go to people in sort of mining jobs and they go, oh, what about a program to retrain? We don't want to retrain. We want our old lives, we want our old jobs, right? We want things to be the way they were. And that fear of how is this all going to work later? We don't see how it can work, and we don't see what our place in it is going to be. I'm not sure we like how it's going to look. That's what comes to mind when I hear a lot of these questions. I have no idea which question I answered.
Our host very properly suggests we go to the floor.
Yeah.
So there's at least one microphone here, and two of you can line. We'll go as long as we can. Yes, sir, please.
Hi, my name is Robert Chu from Cambridge, and I have a great concern about our fragile democracy. I saw a movie last night at Kennedy School, and it's on Netflix, available for anyone. It's called Come Here, Get Me Roger Stone. And if that doesn't get people fighting mad to take back our country, it should. As a matter of fact, another film I just saw was The Darkest Hour, with Churchill standing up and saying, we're going to fight for our island, and standing up to Hitler. And both of those provoked me to think, my question is, if the Democratic Party, which is not an ideal party at all, it has a lot of problems, if we don't fight like hell and take back the Congress and vote out the spineless Republicans, we're going to lose our democracy. And I don't know if anyone would agree with that in November, but we got to do it.
Thank you. Does anybody want to respond to that?
Well, why don't we
questions?
get a few
Collect
questions?
questions.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm a graduate student from Boston College. I have a question for maybe the sociologists, but maybe everyone. So there are some sociologists in the field who believe that we should think of America or theorize America as an empire rather than a nation state. Would you agree with this? And if so, do you think it changes the question about who belongs or doesn't?
You all want to wait to hear all the questions? Is that what you're saying? Or do you
Well,
want
I know who the sociologist is, Daniel Go, who writes about U.S. imperialism. There, of course, it's very important to differentiate European imperialism from American imperialism, because we do it through the economy. We do not politically go and colonize it. We colonize through the lifestyle, through the consumption, through shopping malls and things like that. I mean, so what does that do to other societies, and what happens when that intersects with neoliberalism and the priorities of profit rather than human lives is something, yes, we do have to think about, but that all requires critical self-reflexivity. We are not, as a nation, able to, as American I'm talking about, I think, be critically reflexive, because I don't think we study our history enough. We are too much focused on present, and of course neoliberalism's premises is that it is universal, there is no history doesn't matter. I think history matters. We have to re-examine our history.
And much less study the history of any place else.
Exactly,
Much less our own history.
exactly.
One quick word, I'm not a sociologist, but I feel qualified to jump in. I'm familiar with the work you're talking about. My only concern about that is that sets up like as if empire and nation state are not closely interrelated.
Oh yeah, they are the
right?
same.
There's no empire that has not had a nation state as its foundation, I can say, being Indian. The first question, just really quick, and maybe a couple of questions at a time, whatever you'll think. One thing that popped to mind very quickly is two different things. I mean, at one point at the beginning, you said take our country back, and that made my ears stand up. But then you said take Congress back. So I see those as two different things. They're not really. Take our country back made me immediately want to say, didn't you hear what I said about whose country it is, right? We have to figure out whose country it is. So, but take the Congress back, that's a different question. I can sign up for
Please.
Hi, I'm
trying to phrase this question as I think aloud, but I want to come back to David's question, which I think you all punted on a little bit, to offer and to challenge you to offer a prescriptive norm of what ideal multi-ethnic society can look like, because if, as Rina is saying, a civic nationalism is the best we can hope for in a world of nation states, that's where we are. And if, as Jan was saying, that even espousing certain liberal ideals of gender equality or sexual equality or LGBT rights itself becomes suspect as an effort to push out the other, the Muslim and so forth, can a multi-ethnic society articulate and demand adherence to certain liberal values that are ultimately designed to be liberal and protective of the other, the LGBT, the women, and so forth. And the challenge I see, or the conflict I see, is that we also tie ourselves up in knots when we, are so, the tolerance of everybody, of everything, and that's where the hate speech comes in, and that's where the hate values come in. Does that have to be accepted within a multi-ethnic society? Can a multi-ethnic society exist by accepting everything, or does it then just become nothing and chaos? So what is the prescriptive ideal?
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, thanks again for the question. I think that many of us indeed give a rather dark picture this afternoon. And in the terms of civic and ethnic nationalism are very helpful to describe it, because in the many countries we are discussing and we are researching, there is, I think, a shift from the civic to the ethnic. And that's not only true in the US, but it's also true in France, which might see itself as very civic, right? But it become also very much defined in very specific values that then, of course, are propagated as universal, but at the same time, as you described very nicely this morning in the session, they are highly specific and also exclusionary towards others. So there's this broader tendency from civic to ethnic. That's not what we want. At the same time, my story can be understood as slightly more ambivalent, right? Because it is also about the rise and the embrace of progressive values. And in the earlier days, then you would expect that being progressive and being tolerant would go together. The problem is that also progressive people can be highly intolerant. But I do see in the Netherlands, it has a performative effect. So all the time emphasizing women's rights and LGBT rights creates something like, okay, but then we should be tolerant towards minorities, groups in a disqualified, in a discriminated situation. So why then not having the re-embracement of the notion of tolerance itself? And not just for those specific groups, but then we should rethink. And that gets closer to, of course, then a civic notion that is not relativistic, to be totally clear, and I totally agree with you there, but that is far from saying some people are, by color or by birth or whatever, more core of the nation than others, right? Everybody can become part of that nation.
Does anybody have a model nation we can look to?
And I try to avoid that, right, that question. It is not such a country, I guess.
You say what?
Well, I'm curious to hear from the audience, but I mean, we are clearly hesitant to name countries, right, that are closer to this ideal of civic nationalism. What we do see is that many go from civic to ethnic understandings of nationalism. But are there good examples you can think of countries that have become more civic recently? I'm afraid that's very hard to come up with.
Let me just add that, ethnic, of course, you can touch, you can see to a certain degree. Civic is an abstract notion. Modernity's main problem is that the notions, the concepts we have a certain level of abstraction. You cannot find them actually there. And I'm now very upset about this imagined part of the imagined community that nationalism entails. Because when you say imagined, well, everybody imagines it differently. So what happens if those imaginations don't all go along? And how do you take that theory and what happens in praxis? There is a lot of variation. The only insight I have is Hannah Arendt's insight is, I think if we have individuals as the unit of analysis, it's going to be difficult. We have to think of communal again. Maybe that is the way to go, of communal rights and responsibilities.
I'm eager to hear the other questions, but let me just say one brief thing. This is not the first time we've seen this movie, folks.
Right.
I mean, my mother was Jewish. She wasn't considered American. I'm married to a Catholic boy. There was a time when the Catholics were considered, and Irish were considered black.
Yeah.
We have done this our whole national lives. We can do it again. We just need to want to. And we just need, and I would never, I mean, I've worked in identity politics my whole life. I've worked on race and gender my whole life. We just need to add back class. Yeah.
I was going to ask a question, but now I'm just going to make a very simple statement about primary education. And that's because basically we're standing here in this room because of what we've learned, 30, 40 years ago in kindergarten. And I am a child of a white American working class woman born abroad, and she's still waiting for the Trump miracle, which is supposed to come and fix
Bless her
everything.
heart, yeah.
So when I look at my teenage children who go to an American school in Nigeria, their attitudes towards LGBT and smoking come from school. I didn't teach it at home. And so I'm wondering if maybe this is a class here for young people, just like 20 years ago, 30 years ago in America, we were studying diversity and what that meant. I think though it has to include the new minority,
Of course.
which is working class America.
And just to say, I mean, my next project is to write a book trying to reinstill civics in the United States.
Good. Terrific. Terrific. I think the hook is here. Take it away.
What'd you just call me? I'm kidding. Thank you very much to our panelists, to David Gergen for moderating this panel. We could go on for another hour. It's a sign of the skill with which the conversation was conducted and the brilliance and thoughtfulness of our panelists. So thank you very much. I'm going to offer some quick concluding remarks and some thanks. I realize that I'm standing between you and the weekend and or the reception. I know that's in there too, Liz. Thank you. So I will be brief. I want to thank. This has been a fantastic conference. I want to thank first the Academic Ventures group that planned it, Becky Wasserman and her amazing staff, Sean O'Donnell, Jennifer Burkett, Kristen Osborne, Maura Madden. I want to thank Jessica Vickland and her fantastic events staff. I want to thank the planning committee, a number of professors who actually for over a year planned the event. That includes Professors Sarah Bleich, Melanie Kamet, Jane Kamensky, Michelle Lamont, and Mark Tushnet. And I'd be remiss if I didn't thank our dean, Liz Cohen. I've known Liz for a long time. She is a fellow scholar of U.S. politics, as am I, but she insisted throughout my time here at Radcliffe that we include, indeed prioritize, global perspectives, and she insisted on the centrality of the arts and humanities to what we do, science as well, by the way. And so when you see Jhumpa Lahiri, Celeste Ng, Cynthia Lopez, Marie Aggie Carter, and others, thank Liz. I mean, she has really introduced that and made it central to our culture. And as you may know, she is concluding her decanal services here within a few months. We're not going to lose her, I know, but yes, but we're going to miss you as a dean, and thank you so much. I do want to offer just a quick set of concluding remarks because Liz told me to. Who belongs? This is a quotidian call. It is answered every day, as is the question posed, by institutions and rules that are every bit as a part of our fabric in life, but are often less visible, sometimes entirely invisible. So I want to focus on two categories, written rules and unwritten rules, if you will. We heard about written rules in the world of birthright citizenship. We heard about how structures of law, particularly birthright citizenship, converts the state into something of an emperor of whim, of chance, of just where did you happen to be born, and then converting that into your status, your identity, your resources. We heard Martha Jones talk about the limited and discretionary ways in which birthright citizenship was applied and extended in her wonderful metaphor, birthright citizenship as the haven and the scythe at once. We heard Sarah Leah Whitson describe about how in Jordan, Jordanian birthright citizenship was linked to Jordanian fatherhood, but not to Jordanian motherhood, or to the children of Jordanian mothers without Jordanian fathers. It's worth remembering that the birther movement, or that meme, for a while linked to a different kind of citizenship, one actually not connected to the 14th Amendment, but connected to Article 2 of our Constitution, the original Constitution, and the way that it defines eligibility for our presidency. We also talked about immigration structures. Immigration judges of the sort that were talked about by Professor Carrie Hong of Boston College Law School. And it's interesting that those judges are answerable to and employed by not the Supreme Court or the judicial branch, but by the executive branch, which is one reason that they are subject to some of the directives of Attorney General Sessions and of President Trump, which means at some level that the access to an independent judiciary in our country is itself conditioned upon citizenship. And as another way of thinking about written rules, we heard about the really interesting research of Tali Mendelberg and the way in which even a voting rule, which is to say what's the threshold that determines by which something gets passed or failed in a vote, majority or simple unanimity, about the way that that affects the way people participate. So the written rules are there with us everywhere. But I think rules are often sometimes most powerful when they're implicit, when they're unwritten, and when they're assumed. I have a friend, an African-American man I've known for a long time, a good friend. He's a PhD psychologist. He told me something recently, which kind of stuck with me. He said, well, when you hear about the canary in the coal mine, the really important point when you're hearing about that metaphor and a canary in the coal mine isn't about the canary. It's about the context. It's about the gaseous threats that are emerging from the coal mine. And so the point isn't really about the thing that keels over and stops chirping. It's about the context, right? And that invisible context, I think, is with us everywhere. To get back to, for instance, Tali Mendelberg's idea of just the number of people in the room who are women. I mean, a lot of the experimental subjects probably didn't know that, oh, look, it's all women, or it's 80% women as opposed to 20% women. And yet, that invisible fact structured the way they treated others and the way they rated them as influential. You can think about Fatma Müge Göçek's point about, well, does everybody just have one identity, just one nationality? That's a common assumption that we all make. Or Joan Williams's, I think, very thoughtful, poignant criticism, have working class people of whatever race in this country, in the United States, been stripped of a certain degree of cultural citizenship or of educational citizenship? Have they been assumed irredeemable based on where they live? I note, as somebody who grew up in a small town in the Midwest, that is not merely a simple white racial fact that she's pointing to. There were many Native American reservations that went from 60-40 Obama-Romney to 60-40 Trump-Clinton for some of the same reasons, namely that their economies had been wrecked in recent years. Does that mean that dynamics are not racial? Of course not. Does that mean they're deeply involved with class and economic trajectories? Yes, it does. We heard Niloufer Gold's discussion of Muslim women in Europe, especially France, and the idea of the burkini, and her asking this question of, does belonging entail the subjugation of our identities for some people? For instance, of the idea of the corporeal person or of or personhood, and how people, especially Muslim women, treat, cover, and display their own bodies. Or think of the father in Jhumpa Lahiri's beautiful story, Il Confine, the boundary. That father who had retreated to the countryside, who in a sense had exiled himself from his own nation, his new nation, living away from the city so he didn't have to expose his shattered teeth. So he didn't have to expose his infacility with the English or the official tongue. So who belongs strikes me as the fundamental political question of our time. And our answers often come in the form of borders, not merely concrete borders, but categorical borders. And those borders can be fluid, they can be paraffin, they can be cemented in a Trumpian fantasy and built very high. But those borders are always constructed, even if the president wishes to construct them. But that means not just that the cement borders are constructed, but so are the categorical ones. And so to get back to one of the calls from one of our very first speakers today, Professor Carrie Hong, maybe we in part start changing those borders by changing our talk, by changing the talk, including, to get back to Joan Williams, the talk that we regularly and assumedly carry on in our universities. And I'll conclude there.